The psychology of people who apologize too much. Ruth Anderson said sorry 17 times before noon on a Tuesday in April, and she had done nothing wrong. Not a single thing. Sorry for asking the grocery clerk where the soup was located. Sorry for her cart being in the aisle when another shopper needed to pass. Sorry for paying with exact change. Sorry for existing in spaces where other people also existed. At 62 years old, Ruth had been apologizing her entire life, and she had become so practiced at it that the words tumbled out before she even realized what she was saying. Her daughter Jennifer had noticed it for years, but that particular Tuesday morning when she stopped by her mother's house for coffee, she decided enough was enough. Ruth apologized for the coffee being too hot, and then for it possibly being too weak, and then for the kitchen being messy even though it was spotless. Jennifer set down her mug and looked at her mother with love and exasperation mixed together in equal measure. "Mom," she said gently, "why do you apologize for everything?" Ruth looked startled, as if she had been caught doing something shameful. "Oh, I'm sorry," she began, and then stopped herself, mid-sentence hearing her own words. Her hand flew to her mouth and she actually laughed. "I just did it again, did I not?" Jennifer reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "You have been doing it my whole life," she said softly, "and I wonder if you even know why." Ruth sat quietly for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup, as if the answer might be floating there among the cream. She'd apologized for adding, the truth was she did not know when it started. Perhaps it was growing up as the youngest of 5 children in a house where being quiet and unobtrusive was the safest way to be. Perhaps it was marrying young to a man who had strong opinions about everything and little patience for discussion. Perhaps it was working for 30 years as a secretary, where her job had been to smooth over problems and make everyone else comfortable. Or perhaps it was simply the way women of her generation had been taught to move through the world, taking up as little space as possible, apologizing for their very presence, making themselves small so others could feel big. Ruth had never questioned it before. It was as natural as breathing. But sitting across from her daughter, who had been raised to speak her mind and take up space and never apologize for existing, Ruth suddenly felt tired. Tired of saying sorry. Tired of shrinking. Tired of being 62 years old and still acting like she needed permission to be alive. "I think," Ruth said slowly, "I learned a long time ago that apologizing made things easier." "Easier for who?" Jennifer asked. Ruth did not have an answer for that. Over the next few weeks, Ruth began to notice her apologies in a way she never had before. She apologized to the mailman for having mail to deliver. She apologized to the doctor for being sick enough to need an appointment. She apologized to the rain for getting wet. She apologized to inanimate objects when she bumped into them. Each time she caught herself, she felt a strange mix of embarrassment and curiosity. What was she really apologizing for? And more importantly, what was she afraid would happen if she stopped? The answer came to her one afternoon. At the library where she had volunteered for the past 10 years, Ruth was reshelling books in the history section when a young woman approached her. The woman was perhaps 30, with uncertain eyes and a nervousness that Ruth recognized immediately. "Excuse me," the woman said. "I am so sorry to bother you, but could you help me find books about starting a business?" Ruth smiled warmly and started to say, "Of course I am sorry, I did not see you there." But she stopped herself. She had done nothing wrong. She was exactly where she was supposed to be doing, exactly what she was supposed to be doing. "I would be happy to help you," Ruth said instead. "The business section is right this way." As they walked together, the young woman kept apologizing. Sorry for taking up Ruth's time. Sorry for not knowing where things were. Sorry for asking too many questions. Ruth saw herself reflected back, like looking in a mirror that showed the past. This young woman believed the same lie Ruth had believed, that her needs were an imposition, that her presence required justification, that she should apologize for taking up space in the world. When they reached the business section, Ruth did something she had never done before. She gently placed her hand on the young woman's arm and said, "You do not need to apologize for asking for help." The woman looked surprised. "I am just so sorry for bothering you," she said automatically. "You are not a bother," Ruth said firmly. "Helping people is why I am here, and asking questions is how we learn, and you have every right to both." Something shifted in the young woman's face. "I do apologize a lot, do I not?" she said with a small, embarrassed laugh. "I do too," Ruth admitted. "I have been doing it my whole life, but I'm trying to understand why." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment. Two women generations apart, connected by the same habit of making themselves small. "My mother used to apologize for everything," the young woman said quietly. I swore I would not be like her, but here I am. Ruth nodded, understanding completely. I think we learned it somewhere along the way. She said that being sorry is safer than being confident, that taking up less space means less conflict. But is it true, the young woman asked? Ruth thought about her marriage to Harold, who had passed away 5 years earlier. She had spent 40 years apologizing to him. Sorry for burning dinner. Sorry for being tired. Sorry for having opinions that differed from his. And he had accepted her apologies as his due, never once questioning whether she had anything to actually apologize for. She thought about her job, where she had apologized for asking for raises she had earned and for taking sick days when she was genuinely ill. She thought about her friendships, where she always apologized, first even when she was not the one who had done wrong. All that apologizing had not made her safer, it had made her invisible. No, Ruth said finally, I do not think it is true at all. The young woman selected several books about entrepreneurship and starting small businesses. Before she left, she turned to Ruth and said, Thank you for helping me and for what you said. I am going to try to notice when I apologize for no reason. So am I, Ruth promised. That evening, Ruth called her son Thomas, who lived 2 states away. They talked every Sunday, but Ruth felt compelled to call him right then. Mom, is everything okay? Thomas asked with immediate concern. Ruth realized she had trained her children to expect apologies or emergencies, never just calls to connect. Everything is fine, she said. I just wanted to hear your voice. There was a pause, and then Thomas laughed warmly. You do not need a reason to call Mom, you know that, right? But she had always felt like she did. After they talked for a while about his work and his children, Ruth took a deep breath. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. Do I apologize too much? Another pause. Yeah, Mom, you do, Thomas said gently. You always have, but we love you anyway. Do you know why I do it? Ruth asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. I think, he said carefully, you were always trying to keep the peace with Dad, and maybe it just became a habit. Ruth felt tears prick her eyes because it was true. Harold had not been a bad man, but he had been a difficult one, set in his ways and certain he was right about everything. And Ruth had learned early in their marriage that apologizing was easier than arguing, even when she had done nothing wrong. I am trying to stop, Ruth said. Good, Thomas replied. You deserve to take up space. Mom, you deserve to exist without apologizing for it. After they hung up, Ruth sat in her living room looking at the life she had built. The house was hers now, decorated the way she wanted, organized to suit her needs. She could eat dinner at 9 at night if she felt like it. She could leave dishes in the sink until morning. She could watch whatever she wanted on television. She could exist without apologizing. So why was it so hard? The next Sunday, Ruth attended her usual church service. She had been going to the same church for 40 years, sitting in the same pew, apologizing for arriving, apologizing for leaving. That morning, she arrived a few minutes late. Because she had been enjoying her coffee and did not rush, she walked down the aisle to her usual spot where another woman was sitting. The old Ruth would have apologized profusely and found somewhere else to sit. The new Ruth, who was still learning, simply smiled and sat in the pew behind instead. It was a small thing, but it felt revolutionary. After the service, the pastor, Father Michael, stopped her. Ruth, you look different today, he said with a kind smile, more peaceful somehow. I am trying something new, Ruth admitted. I am trying to stop apologizing for existing. Father Michael nodded slowly. That is a worthy endeavor, he said. We were all created with purpose, and presence is not something that requires an apology. I wish I had learned that 60 years ago, Ruth said. Well, Father Michael replied, the second best time to learn something is now. Ruth joined a book club that met at the library on Thursday evenings. She had thought about joining for years, but it always felt like she would be imposing. The first meeting she attended, she walked in and sat down, without apologizing for being new. When it was her turn to share her thoughts about the book they had read, she offered her opinion clearly and did not apologize before or after. One of the other women smiled at her and said, I love that perspective, Ruth. I had not thought about it that way. Ruth felt something warm bloom in her chest. Pride, maybe, or simply the satisfaction of being heard. The weeks turned into months, and Ruth's experiment in not apologizing continued. She still slipped sometimes. The habit was deep, but she was becoming more aware, more intentional, more present in her own life. Jennifer noticed the change. You seem happier, Mom, she said one afternoon. I think I am, Ruth replied. I think I spent so long making myself small that I forgot I was allowed to be full-sized. You were always full-sized to me. Jennifer said, I just do not think you saw yourself that way. Ruth thought about the young woman at the library who apologized for everything. She wondered if that woman had managed to start her business, if she had stopped apologizing quite so much. She hoped so. One Saturday morning, Ruth was at the farmer's market selecting tomatoes when she accidentally bumped into another shopper. "Oh, I am so sorry," she began automatically. But then she stopped. She smiled at the person and said, "Excuse me," instead, because excuse me was polite, but sorry implied she had done something wrong. And she had not. She had simply existed in a public space, where existing sometimes meant bumping into people. The other shopper smiled back and said, "No problem at all." And that was that. No drama, no conflict, no need for apology. Ruth realized something profound in that moment. All those years she had been apologizing to prevent conflict, but the conflict she feared had mostly existed in her own mind. People were not angry at her for existing. She had just been taught to believe they might be. That evening, Ruth sat down and wrote a letter to her younger self. The Ruth who had been 22 and newly married, the Ruth who had just learned she was pregnant with Jennifer, the Ruth who was beginning a lifetime of apologies. She wrote about what she had learned, about the difference between being kind and making yourself small, about how taking up space is not the same as being selfish, about how apologizing for everything means your real apologies lose their power. She wrote about the importance of being seen. She did not mail the letter, of course, but she put it in a frame and hung it on her bedroom wall where she would see it every morning, a reminder to herself that she was enough, that she was